Welcome to this special from Windows on the World. Tonight we're talking about a civilization that swept across the whole of Europe up to the Indus Valley, into Russia, and up to Scandinavia. And that's just the start of it. And this was before the Huns, the Turks, or the Mongols. And we're talking about 2200 BC when the Scythians came onto the scene. They were from eastern Iran, Persian, and they allegedly spoke around 7 languages. This is a group of people, a nomadic tribal group, which was extremely successful because they worked on horseback. They were very good archers. They were very good soldiers, but they were also incredibly self-sufficient. And what we're going to be talking about is how this ties in to the history that we've been covering on the recent shows. And it goes into the work of William Comyns Beaumont also. And the Scythians do get a mention in the Bible, and they were not the nicest people according to certain sources, but there was such a vast culture that we have to remember that obviously they were very successful and people would have wanted to denigrate them. So we're going to be talking about this culture this evening, and it's going to tie into our recent shows on history. I'm going to give you a quote first from Herodotus, who was this Greek historian, 5th century BC, who was very familiar with the Scythians. And he said the most important of discovery by any people that I know was made by the Scythians. Their greatest discovery is to stop any invader escaping them and make it impossible for anyone to catch them. They have no cities nor walls, but they are horse archers who carry their own homes. They don't subsist from agriculture, but from their animals. With their houses on wheels, how could they not be invincible or impossible to fight a battle with? So we're talking about this nomadic culture who used horses, kept their own animals, and were on the move constantly. And this was one of the reasons why they couldn't be conquered, because they could actually move through armies, and they would do this in such a way that was very strategic, so that they could exhaust the enemy and strategically beat them. So they were a nomadic people, and we'll go into the official story first of what the Scythians were. The Scythians were a group of nomadic horse-riding people who lived in the Eurasian steppe, a vast grassland region stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. And they're believed to have been speakers of the ancient Eastern Iranian language. And what's interesting about the Scythians is that they were pale-skinned. They had mainly red hair, some were blonde, and had blue eyes. And we still see the remains of these people through Asia, through Turkey, and into Eastern Europe, and right up to Asia. And of course, they went as far as the Indus Valley. So this is a culture that has been largely forgotten, which is why I wanted to cover it. The official time period of the Scythians was, they say, from around 900 BC to 200 BC, with their influence extending from China to the northern Black Sea. So if you go through Eastern Europe, you will find many Scythian strongholds. And if you look up Scythian cities, you will find them so numerous that I won't bother to list them. But what was interesting about the Scythians is that they weren't based anywhere. They were a group of sometimes competing tribes, and they had a pyramid of power, which was a priest class, warriors, and a common class. And this priest class were very important, and the warriors were of a type who were meant to be very open in the respect that they fought alongside their wives. So both sexes were fighting on horseback. Both sexes were trained in archery from a very young age. And of course, they threw javelins, spears, and they used these short Iranian swords. So we've said that they were from eastern Iran, but they spread through, and I have to give you a list here because there's so many places that they went into. Thrace, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Scandinavia, Russia, Kazakhstan, the Indus Valley, the Altai Mountains, into Mongolia, and up to China. So just think about that. Think about how far they went from the ancient Persian Empire, swept through Europe, right up into China, into Russia. Very interestingly, ending up in Scandinavia. And this is where the Comins-Beaumont history really kicks in with this. And actually, it does compare very well with what another writer, who I'm going to quote from, says. And that writer is John Pinkerton, and he wrote The Progress of the Scythians or the Goths. So his contention is that the Scythians were the same people as the Goths, or they absorbed the Goths, and they were also a tribe called the Getae. And the Pelasgi, or the Hellenes, also known as the Greeks, were also Scythians. So this is really interesting, that the Scythians were such a large population that they managed to infiltrate all these different places. So I'm going to now give you the official version of what a Scythian was. It was a member of a nomadic people originally of Iranian stock, known from as early as the 9th century BC, who migrated westward from Central Asia to southern Russia and Ukraine in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The Scythians founded a rich, powerful empire centered on what is now Crimea. The empire survived for several centuries before succumbing to the Sarmatians, which was another huge empire. But the interesting thing here, which I would like to add, is that Pinkerton maintains that the Sarmatians and the Scythians were very much the same people. They did actually conglomerate at one point, and it is his contention that because these were tribal nomads and they were a number of different tribes, but they were under one civilization, that the Sarmatians and the Scythians were very much the same people. And this is during the period from the 4th century BC to the 2nd century AD. And even by the 12th century, the Scythians were still around, and the remains of the Scythian culture can be found in North Ossetia in Russia. But of course, their seed will have spread all over those regions that we've talked about. So we've got the Scythian culture going from Asia into Europe and right into Russia and Ukraine. So those people, those blonde-haired, red-haired people with blue eyes, were the main component genetics of the Scythians, and their genetics have been found in many different places. So the migration of the Scythians from Asia eventually brought them into the territory of the Cimmerians, who had traditionally controlled the Caucasus and the plains of the Black Sea. Now, the Cimmerians is very interesting because Comins-Beaumont mentions the Cimmerians, and the Cimmery, the Cimbri, he says, could have become the Cymri, or the modern day Welsh, which were in ancient times called the Cymry or the Cymry. And this is very interesting because once we start looking at the names of places, then we start to look also at the possible replacement of names, which is something that William Comins-Beaumont goes into. And his relocation of Christianity is one of the most fascinating things that I have come across ever in history. And the great thing about it is it adds up. So this show is to add to that body of knowledge, to make it nice and clear for people so they can go away and do their own research. And it was a group called the Medes who ruled Persia, who finally drove out the Scythians. And in the end, they were conquered. But of course, they were assimilated into all of these different places. So yes, the Scythian Empire stretched from to the west, from Mongolia to China, and from northwest Iran to the Danube, very important, and down to Central Asia, and it reached as far as the Arabian Sea. and it included modern-day Greece, Macedonia, Thrace, Turkey, Bulgaria, Hungary, and even, this is what I wanted to add, Poland. And a lot of the Scythians would have ended up as Poles. So the Polish people have a lot of Scythian influence in their genetic makeup. I'm going to read to you something very interesting now, and it's from the Declaration of Arbroath, 1320. And the Declaration of Arbroath, if you don't know, is a letter by the Scottish barons and the freeholders to Pope John the 22nd. The letter asked the Pope to recognize Scotland's independence, and they wanted to be sovereign with Robert the Bruce as their rightful king. I'm going to read you a short passage from that because it's quite important, because when we look at Scandinavia and Scotland and how the Scots intermarried with the Scandinavian monarchy, we can also see the Scythian influence there. And a very important point about Scandinavia was that around the 1200s, Scandinavia was not very populated. The mountain regions, of which there are, of course, the majority through the Scandinavian countries, were not populated. People lived mainly on the coast. And this is very, very important to remember. So when we're talking about Scandinavia, we have to remember that it had a very, very small population. And when the Scythians went there, they would, of course, have been very dominant. So again, we know that Scandinavians were blonde, but the Scythians were blonde or red-haired. So we see this term used with the Celtic people. And the Celtic people were nothing like as advanced or as widespread as the Scythians. But we hear more about the Celts. It's kind of become more fashionable to talk about Celts because we now sort of associate the Celts with the red hair. But that's not necessarily true, because the Iranians, the Persians, and the Middle Eastern people were the original redheads. And that is according to DNA analysis from the Middle East. And of course, if we look at modern day Middle Eastern culture, especially within Islam, we see that red hair is revered in the Islamic world. So again, very interesting. Let's now get on with the Declaration of Arbroath. Most Holy Father and Lord, we know, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients, we find that among other famous nations, our own, the Scots, has been graced with widespread renown. They journeyed from Greater Scythia by way of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and dwelt for a long course of time in Spain among the most savage tribes. But nowhere could they be subdued by any race, however barbarous. Thence they came, 1200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, to their home in the west, where they still live today. The Britons they first drove out, the Picts they utterly destroyed, and even though very often assailed by the Norwegians, the Danes, and the English, they took possession of that home with many victories and untold efforts. And as the historians of old time bear witness, they have held it free of all bondage ever since. I hope that's inspiring to anyone who's listening from Scotland. And it should be of great interest as well. So Scotland was then populated by these collapsing civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East, from the Hittites to the Scythians, the Scythians, who were at this point around the Black Sea area, moving outwards, obviously, eventually into what is now Mongolia, Russia, China, and the Indus Valley. But they moved north and into Scandinavia. So that's what we're talking about here. So the Egyptians and some of the sons of Esau, who had married into both Hittite and Egyptian royalty, their genetic characteristics were of red hair and blue eyes. So this is something I think people may find rather fascinating, because with this idea of the destruction of races, we need to go back to history to find out what really went on. And as I said, the Scythians date from around 2200 BC. And they had very decorative costumes. They were quite civilized. They used a lot of gold, bone, leather, kept their own animals. And yes, they used this Eastern Iranian language, and they kept sheep, cows, and goats. And the power shifted a lot between the tribes. So the priesthood of the Scythians would have been very important and powerful to keep these tribes in check, because there are reports that they were quite unruly. They did like a drink. They used to drink undiluted wine, very strong wine, and they used to make a sort of ancient version of modern day rakia or sapporo, which they made out of cow's milk. So it must have tasted pretty horrible, but it was incredibly strong. Another thing about the Scythians is that they smoked marijuana, but they didn't smoke it in rolled up cigarettes or joints. They smoked it as a group. So they would burn some and they would all sit around inhaling it. So there's some quite amusing aspects to this, because when you think that they were some of the best archers the world had ever seen, and at the end of the day they lie around getting really drunk and stoned, it's quite amusing. And they weren't very sexist either. The wives, as I said, were warriors, and they fought side by side, and they had very colorful clothing. They weren't drab at all. They had these sort of pointed hats that were made out of felt and very brightly colored clothes. They wore a lot of sheepskins, obviously, because it's pretty cold where they were. But if you look at Scythian ceremonial garments, they're really good. They're not too ornate, but they're very stylish. I've just been looking at that this week. That's why this show's taken quite a long time to put together, because I had information to put it out a couple of days ago, but I kept finding a lot more, and I wanted to give you a good overview in this show. So I'm going to read now from the Riddle of Prehistoric Britain by William Comyns Beaumont. The Getae, the Massagetae, the Parthians, whose name Parthai signified exiles, and Scythians, all were racially the same. Now, this is interesting because this ties in with John Pinkerton, who's a very renowned historian in the early 1900s. And we are going to be quoting from his book and using Beaumont's quotes because they put the thing into a different perspective. And Beaumont also says they were close kindred with the Thracians. Very true. These all became the same people. So when you think about these old maps, go and have a look at an old map from 1,000 years ago, the oldest maps you can find, and look at where Thrace was. Look at places on that map. Look at Thessaly. Look at where Greece was, the Hellenes, where they came from, and how these cultures absorbed all of these different regions. So this also brings something very important up, in that there would have been a spreading of this culture which absorbed other cultures. So when we talk about the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who are we really talking about? Because the Scythians were there first, all the way across Europe into these other areas. So their influence was much, much bigger. And of course, this was before the Huns. That was about 400 to 500 AD. And the Mongols and the Genghis Khan armies, that was much later. But the Mongolian Empire, of course, and these later empires were way later than the Scythians. So it's very, very interesting. And another thing that Beaumont says is one might compare the Northern Scots with the Norwegians, who in turn were originally Caledonians or Picts. Well, that's interesting because there are still Picts in Scotland. Short, stocky, quite aggressive. I know a few of them. And I'm not saying all Picts are like that, by the way, but the ones I know that say they're Picts are sort of warrior types. And that's very interesting, isn't it? So the Scythians have infiltrated all of these different cultures. So we have to ask ourselves, as Europeans, how much influence has this group had on us? And could our ancient ancestors have been Scythians. And it's very, very possible, of course. So the Scythians held their wives in common, and Dion, who is being quoted here by Beaumont, says, tells an interesting story on this custom. The Empress Julia Augusta, wife of Severus, taunted the wife of Argentoxus, a Parthian or Scythian. This was a Scythian king, Argentoxus. Argentocoxus. He was Parthian or Scythian, same thing. He was a king and he was in Britain. And this Empress Julia Augusta, wife of Severus, taunted this Argentocoxus, is his wife, about the promiscuous married, how they married between the sexes in Caledonia. And the wife of Argentocoxus retorted that whereas in Britain women openly had intercourse with their finest men, in Rome they practiced secret adultery with the worst of them. So they were pretty quick-witted and sharp as well, which is interesting. So the Scythians, or the Goths of Scandinavia, according to Beaumont, laid Egypt to waste, led by the prophet Zalmoxis. And this is where we get into the work of Beaumont. And he now quotes from Josephus and in his Antiquities of the Jews that Magog was the patriarch or progenitor of the Scythians. And there is reason to believe that the Swedes who invaded and settled in Scandinavia and northern Russia were the original Scythians. This was actually according to someone called Jonandes, who was a Goth. Now, he's the only person that Pinkerton quotes as saying this. But there are many, many sources that say that the Scythians came from Iran. They spoke an Iranic language, and they were kind of in competition with the other Iranian group, the Medes. But it's interesting that we have at least one account from someone who was a Goth, obviously, in Sweden, in Scandinavia, that the Scythians were actually Goths and that they had come from Jutland. They had come from Scandinavia. So that's very, very interesting. And Beaumont does latch onto this because obviously it goes with his theory of this migration from the north to the south, whereas obviously we'd be talking about a migration from the south into the east, west, and then up into the north. So he goes on to say, Beaumont, that the Scots, originally Scuti, he said, I'm not including the Celtic folk of the north and the west here, are of like Scythian descent and were invaders of our country at a date by no means resolved. But if the Trojans found them here and their advent is more or less established, Gog and Magog record an event even earlier, despite the supposed Bible chronological period of which Ezekiel writes. And he says the story of Gog and Magog has been told in various texts since the 6th century BC. And this is including the Syriac Alexander legend, the Quran, and the Historia Regum Britannia. So those are the sources that Beaumont gives. It is entirely possible Scythians travelled from Scandinavia to Scotland. Well, of course it is. It was so near. And this, I think, is something that really does make sense. I'm going to give you another quote from Herodotus here about the Scythians to give you an idea about these wandering nomads who lived in caravans, who arrived at places, and there was so many of them. It looked like a city on wheels had arrived. So you can imagine that this must have been quite an incredible sight. And of course, they were on these flatlands called the steppe, which goes from Persia right up into Eastern Europe and then up towards Russia and into Ukraine and the other way towards China. So obviously, these people had massive armies, and that was the trick. That was why they were so successful. They didn't actually have a central base. They didn't have a place that they called home. Like They didn't have a central base like Rome or Constantinople. They had cities that were Scythian that they'd adopted. And those cities are so numerous. Just look up Scythian cities, and they're too numerous to mention here. But Herodotus, I'm going to quote him again, says, discussing the wandering Scythians who once dwelt in Asia, he describes how they quarreled with the Massagetae, a branch of the Goths. This is what actually Beaumont's saying. He's quoting Herodotus here. But this is interesting. I'm going to have to jump in here because John Pinkerton maintains that the Massagetae, the Getae, and the Goths were all Scythians. They were all part of the same group, which does make absolute sense. And so basically, this is where he says they turned their arms against the Cimmerians, and that was a long war. That was quite a long, that was a 30-year war against the people of Cimmeria. And they won that war. They won that war and took it over. So they became Scythian. So they absorbed so many different cultures. And the Cimmerian rulers, hearing how numerous were the invaders, held a council, and some among them decided that they must retire to avoid a contest with so powerful a foe. And the royal tribe decided to die fighting rather than yield. And so the royals of Cimmeria were killed by the Scythians, and the population integrated with them. So this is another interesting thing, that they were probably formerly a channel connecting Norway with Jutland, Denmark. This is what he's saying about the Cimmerians, because they were actually shown to be further down on the map. If you look at where Cimmeria is, it's possible they could have gone up to Scandinavia too. So yes, what came to be called Scythia was formerly Cimmeria. So when we see the original Scythian Empire, it's where this ancient Cimmeria was, and then of course it spread out. And then you will look on a map and you'll see Sarmatia, the Sarmatians. Now the Sarmatians were also absorbed into the Scythians. They all became the same group, but eventually fought amongst each other. And this is what Beaumont is saying now in the Key to World History. This is quite interesting. George Syncellus, a monk in 10 AD, said that Sherston, this place between Bristol and Malmesbury, this is what he's referring to. This George Syncellus said, Scythians overran Bashan. Their camp was called Scythopolis. And Beaumont states this in the book of Judith. That the book of Judith, basically, the biblical book of Judith, happened in Britain. And so Scythopolis was between Bristol and Malmesbury. Well, you can take that with a pinch of salt, or you can look into it. I'm throwing that one in because I find Beaumont's work pretty compelling so far with everything I've looked up. And as I said, it ties in nicely with the work of John Pinkerton. And John Pinkerton, very, very renowned historian. So I'm going to give you some more now from The Great Deception, William Comyns Beaumont. And he's talking about Waddell, who actually translated the Icelandic Edda. He says, Waddell goes farther than this to trace their origins. They were, according to his researches, the old ruling race of Syro-Phoenicia, known in the Old Testament as the Hethites or the Hittites, and were from the Ari or Aria, the noble ones, the men of renown, the true Aryans. Well, they were Aryans because the Aryans came out of this area where the Scythians had come from. The Aryans were Iranian. So he said they were tall, fair complexioned, blue-eyed, wore Phrygian caps and boots. Well, that's interesting, with turned up toes. That's what the Scythians wore. They wore these pointy hats. And we're related to the Goths. Yes, that's true. Goths or Getae, they might be properly Scythians. So this is very interesting that Beaumont is making the same connections as does John Pinkerton, that the Goths, the Getae, the Mesogetai were all the same group, the Scythians. The race of Magog, according to the early Scandinavian writer Johann Magnus, says that King Sven ruled over the Gotthar in Sweden. shortly before the flood and descended from the original Thracian or Titan stock. They called themselves Goth, like the Chaldeans, the Kelidi, the children of God, whose hierarch was the Gad or God, to whom Moses referred to in the highest terms. Quote from Moses. And he provided the first part for himself, because there in the portion of the lawgiver was he seated, and he came with the heads of the people. He executed the justice of the Lord and his judgments with Israel. So this is where Beaumont ties it in to the biblical stories. So we're going to be having some quotes here. This is why I want to give you a lot of information, because if I start talking about this, it will be rather limited. So I'm going to get into a lot of information from John Pinkerton and his book Origins and Progress of the Scythians or Goths. And you can download that. I think it's on Google Books. It was originally published in 1787. So it again quotes Herodotus. The most important discovery by any people that I know was made by the Scythians. Their greatest discovery is this: to stop any invader escaping them and make it impossible for anyone to catch them. They have no cities nor walls, but they are horse archers and carry their homes. They don't subsist from agriculture, but from their animals, with their houses on wheels. How could they not be invincible or impossible to fight a battle with? I know I've quoted some of that before, but it's quite important because it sums them up perfectly. Now we're going to get another quote about the Scythians from Troilus Pompeius. Scythians originated from Asia in the reign of Augustus, 27 BC. Well, we know they go back a lot further than that, but these are Roman commentaries on the Scythians. Eusebius stated that Scythians were the descendants of Noah, which is where the William Comyns Beaumont material comes in. From the deluge to the time of the Tower of Babel, Scythians prevailed and they inhabited the east. This is a quote from Eusebius. So the Scythians built the Tower of Babel. This is what they're stating. They were from the lineage of Shem to Serug, following the Tower of Babel and King Ninus, the founder of the Assyrian Empire, who drove the Scythians of Persia out of the Babylonian Empire in 2200 BC. So this is where they started moving outwards, away from Persia. The original Scythian Empire was bound by the Euphrates in the west and the Indus on the east, and bordered on the Egyptian kingdom. Solinus, now a quote from him: the Albans of Asiatic Scythia have white hair, blue eyes, and see well in the dark. So if you can see well in the dark, you've got blonde or red hair and blue eyes, you might be a Scythian. The Scythians, as we know, were also known as the Goths and the Geti. And they went from Iran to Germany and north to Scandinavia, down to Thrace, into Greece and Turkey. So this is very, very important. So if we're looking at history, we have to remember that most people will go back to the Ottomans, they will go back to the Mongols, they will go back to the Huns, but we're going back way further than that. And in a way, it's so much more important, because if this tribal nomadic people spread all over, then we must have their blood. It must have carried on through Europeans, Scandinavians, up into Mongolia, up into the borders of China and into Russia. And of course, as I stated earlier, North Ossetia, where the last remaining DNA of the Scythians is still to be found in concentrated area. So North Ossetia is now the place where the Scythian kingdom kind of remains. So what's left of the Scythians is in North Ossetia. So yes, so when we're talking about Scythians, we're talking about Persians, and there were two groups of these, the Medes and the Scythians, and they ended up fighting after having been allies, which is very important. So also the Scythians spread, as we know, from Thrace to Illyricum, modern day Albania, Greece, Italy, Germany, Scandinavia. Think about this. Just think about this, and the size of their armies, because when you think that they turn up and it'd be like an invasion of a city. So if they turned up outside a city, it was like a city had turned up outside the city. So you can imagine how many people they must have had traveling with them. Thousands. And these people were self-sufficient. They lived off their own cattle. They weren't farmers. So they were agrarian in a completely self-reliant and sovereign way. So it's something worth thinking about as well, about how we view ourselves, because the sedentary populations in the world now are going to be herded. So maybe it's time to go back to being slightly more nomadic. I know personally it suits me. I love being like that. But it's, as a bit of an aside, very important and something we've been talking about, that if you can live with very few possessions and move around and not be tied to any particular place, then that is actually the real definition of freedom. Freedom even within the system. So these people were very self-reliant, very individualistic. And that is something I think that we can learn from. Definitely. Yes. So their official history started around 900 BC, but as we know, they go back to 2200 BC when they were on the move. That's when they started to move around. So the Assyrian Empire was actually built on the Scythian Empire. Now, the Assyrians conquered the Scythians later, but the Assyrian Empire was actually Scythian in this early period. Both the Greeks and the Romans were Scythians. So this is the interesting thing, how these tribal groups managed to infiltrate and take over these already existing pockets of culture, especially the Hellenes in Greece. And we have to actually look at where the Greeks and the Scythian culture collides and what they have in common, because it's interesting. We hear a lot about ancient Greece, but we don't hear about ancient Scythians. And the Scythians were a big part of ancient Greece. So, yes, the Thracians were a region of Scythia. And according to Herodotus, the Thracians at the time were the most numerous people in the world, apart from the Indians in India, obviously a much bigger continent. But apart from India, the Thracians were the most numerous people in the world. So just think about that. How did the Scythians manage to incorporate Thrace into their empire? It's quite an achievement, isn't it? So apart from India, the Celts and also the Cymry were inferior in civilization and fled the Scythians to Britain and Gaul. Isn't that fascinating? Let's think now, we're going way back before the history we've been talking about. And the Druids goes back to about 2000 years and before. But we know that through their shows that we've been doing, that this Druidic culture spread from Britain to Gaul. People in mainstream academia will say it spread from Gaul to Britain, but as we know, the main learning areas and the main strongholds of this Druidic culture were in Britain. So this is now coming together into something very interesting, and that's why I wanted to do this show, because it brings together the stuff we've been doing on the William Comyns Beaumont books, The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain, The Great Deception, The Mysterious Comet, The Riddle of the Earth, and Britain, the Key to World History. And of course, Beaumont mentions the Scythians many times. So it appears that the Celts were actually wiped out by the Scythians and the Sarmati. And the Sarmati Empire and the Scythian Empire were kind of part of the same region. They're all part of this same region. And as I said, they eventually fought with each other, but then they became absorbed into the same culture. So the Scythians and the Sarmati culture were, again, very, very similar, all part of the same group. So the Celts were mostly wiped out by these people. Fascinating, isn't it, when you think about it? Because, as I said earlier, we get to hear about the Celts all the time, and people say, I'm a Celt. It's very fashionable to say this. But if we think about it, let's go back further. And the Scythians basically wiped the Celts out. The Celts had to get out of all the areas where the Scythians had taken over. And they're saying here that they fled to Britain and to Gaul. So, of course, that's fascinating within itself because it puts a new picture on those people in Britain who we're calling the Druids, because they go back, I think, to about 800 BC. Fascinating. So, the Scythians and the Sarmatians, as I said, were allies. The Thracians extended down to Phocaea. Now, this is to put it in perspective. Phocaea is now called Izmir in Turkey. Think how far that is down into Turkey. Izmir is a long way down. It's a long way south on the coast. So it's on the west coast of Turkey. It used to be called Smyrna. And of course, Sabbatai Zevi was from Smyrna, the port of Smyrna. So Phocaea is where, so yes, Smyrna became Phocaea and is now Izmir. So that's where the Thracians extended to. So yeah, I've got a lot of maps here as well. It's really useful to get some maps when you're looking at the extent of these people and where they went. I'm going to go back now to the riddle of prehistoric Britain, page 176. The Scythians laid Egypt to waste, led by Zalmoxis. According to the modern theory, Zalmoxis was a figure in Greek and Thracian mythology who was believed to have taught the Getae, who were the Scythians, the laws that he'd learned from Pythagoras. Now, that's interesting because we get reports from the Hellenes that the Scythians were basically savages. They were people who were very uncouth. But we're being told here that the Scythians or the Getae, they learned from Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was also considered a god by the Getae. So, sorry, Zalmoxis. And of course, Pythagoras by default was a great teacher to the Scythians. So we can see another picture emerging rather than this one that they were all savages, which is what other cultures have said about them. So the introduction of the Greeks into the Scythian history, this is from Antonius Caracallus, who lived 188 AD to 217 AD. And he said the Goths were then called Getae. So this again backs up both Beaumont and John Pinkerton, that the Goths, the Scythians, and the Getae were the same people. And before 250 AD, the Romans called the Goths or the Scythians Greeks. This is important. So before 250 AD, the Romans referred to the Goths or the Scythians as Greek. Now, doesn't that put a different perspective on ancient Greece? And when the Romans went to war with the Scythians, they called them Goths. Have a think about that. It's pretty mind-blowing, very simple, but that is something that indicates how influential this culture was in history. And we've got to remember also that the Scythians were in Greece by 1500 BC because they'd moved across from eastern Iran, or they'd moved down from Scandinavia, or they could have moved from Iran and also gone up to Scandinavia and moved across. But it depends where you want to get your story from. As I said earlier, Jornandes, this Goth, he said that the Goths, the Getae, the Scythians came from Scandinavia. But of course, they may have gone to Scandinavia and then moved out again. So this is where we have to be discriminating if we can. And the Pelasgi, who were another group who got incorporated into the Scythians, the Pelasgi, they went from Thessaly, which is in Thrace, into Greece. and they became the Scythii, the Getae, and the Goths. Same people, the Pelasgi. They were incorporated into the Scythians. And the Hellenes were also Scythians. So you can see that this was a very clever way of infiltrating, a very clever way of taking over. And because they were nomadic, they couldn't be tied down. They couldn't find a central leader to assassinate because these tribes were on the move everywhere. So they were very, very different for people who had established empires. These people were hard to beat because they were indefinable. So, yes, we're now going to get on to the source of the name Helen or the Hellenes. And Helen was the son of Deucalion. And it is said that Deucalion was a Scythian, Deucalion of the flood. And Lucian de Syrra, another commentator, said the flood happened in the time of the Scythians. And also, it is stated by both Beaumont and John Pinkerton that the Titans of old, the Titans, were also Scythians. So people referred to as Titans were Scythians. Eusebius said that the Ionians were also Scythians. So here we have a different take on Greece and ancient Greece and the Hellenic people. When we look at this, it starts to make more sense that there was an existing culture which swept through huge areas. So we didn't just have an ancient Greek culture. We had this culture which spread out, which was absorbed into a much larger culture. And that really made sense because that was something I had real problems with when I was looking at the Greek and the Roman empires. But without the Scythians, it doesn't make sense. Well, it didn't make sense to me. Academia was compartmentalizing it into something that didn't make sense to me. So now we're going to get onto the Icelandic Edda. And this also brings in the Scythians. Old Icelandic is apparently full of Greek words. The Icelandic, the Old Icelandic, not modern day Icelandic, Old Icelandic has many Greek words, even though the people there knew nothing about the Greeks at the time. And this is from the Icelandic Edda, which was translated by Waddell. Odin was the god of the Scandinavian Goths, the Scythian. Odin led his people into Scandinavia from Scythia, Ukraine to Moldova, modern day, and to Scandinavia, which had very small populations, mainly around the coast. I'm going to quote now to back up what I was saying earlier on. By 1100, Adam of Bremen wrote only the coast of Scandinavia was populated. And remember that the Picts came from Scandinavia into Scotland. But the Scots are saying that the Scythians were also around and they knew about them. That goes back to the Declaration of Arbroath. Remember that? I was talking about that beginning. So Herodotus stated Scythia had 7 languages. Some people have said, in Pinkerton quotes it, that there's up to 28 different languages. It's very unlikely. There may be different cultures that join the Scythians, but within the Scythian culture, they had 7 languages. And we have to remember the official story is that they were Eastern Persian, Iranian language. So let's get now on to the deluge. The Scythians were the first inhabitants of the East after the deluge. Comins Beaumont states, before the flood, King Sven ruled the Goths in the current Sweden. Also, and that Scotland was a very ancient part of Scythia. This is where it starts to get interesting because there was a book that came out years ago called We Are the Scythians, and it was incredibly convoluted, but it took some of the Beaumont stuff and it extended it out to Egypt. Well, we now know that the Scythians went as far as Egypt. So this is all fascinating. And to me, it's put things in a much bigger perspective, and I hope it has for you too. So we'll talk about Sarmatia now. That became part of the Scythian culture. And the Hunnic Empire followed the Scythians. And this is where things changed. The Scythians went sort of downhill a bit. The last Scythians are said to be in Ossetia, but their ancestry is literally everywhere. And the red or white-haired, blue-eyed descendants are scattered over Central Europe into Asia Minor and as far as Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China. So that was an end note that I wrote. But we've got the end of the Scythians was that they were subjugated and integrated with the Sarmatians. So the Sarmatians became the more dominant name, but the culture was already intertwined. These people were very, very similar anyway, if not ruled in the same way. So this is another fascinating thing. So when we talk about the Sarmatians taking over, then we have to remember that they were the Scythians to start with in many respects. So when the Huns invaded, that was 500 AD, of course. The Scythians moved around 500 AD into areas such as Belarus, Ukraine, and into Russia. And by the 1200s, the Scythians became the Alanis, the Alani tribe. They integrated with the Alans. And this is another thing that Beaumont goes into, the tribe of the Alans. And I don't want to load you up with too much stuff tonight, so I might do a part 2 for this. And then, of course, the Mongols came in around the 1200s. So we've got the Genghis Khan armies, the Mongolian hordes, and they took over. But I hope I've given you something there that puts history into context and something that's not really talked about in a wider context. And so if we look at where the Scythians are today, yes, North Ossetia is the place where the Scythian DNA is still concentrated. But of course, it's all through Europe and very much in Poland, Hungary, parts of Bulgaria, Turkey. This is interesting because there are a lot of Turkic people who have this blonde hair or red hair and blue eyes. So the Turkic look that people are familiar with is not all the way through Turkey at all. Turkey has a massive amount of different people. When I was traveling through northern Turkey, many, many blue-eyed blonde people there. And they integrated with the darker Turkic people. So when we look at this and we look at the extent of the Scythian Empire, we can really see it everywhere. And that is something that is still there and still relevant today. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative and I hope it's given you inspiration to go on and do more research, because that's what this show is about. I cannot possibly give you the detail that is required for such a massive story over such a great length of time. But I hope it's fitted in with what we've been putting out over the past several years. And I will carry on with these historic shows and, of course, all the other Windows on the World stuff. So do check out the website, windowsontheworld.net. You can join our Discord group there. I still upload stuff to Odyssey, although we are doing these live shows on YouTube every Sunday. They're usually every Sunday, 8 p.m. GMT. And if you want to support the show, send me an email at info@windowsontheworld.net, or you can support the show on the homepage. So if you're getting great information out of the shows and want to put something back, please do. It helps to keep things going because I charge for nothing. It's all free, open access. So until the next one, I'm going to have a look at the comments because I haven't looked at any tonight. I've been very focused here and I will sign off. So thanks for watching and see you Sunday, windowsontheworld.net and YouTube. And remember, info@windowsontheworld.net if you want to get in contact and send in information, which I'm very grateful for. Thanks a lot.